right, so I have made it to the Second World War. I will be talking about the geopolitics of the greatest and most profound and outstanding conflict in the history of the human race. The second and final part of the Second 30 Years' War is nigh. So I've already covered World War I and the interwar period and some of the geopolitics of the Axis powers. Now, I haven't really talked that much about the Allies. But anyways, so what's going on the geopolitical theater? Well, after the end of the First World War, there was virtually no long-lasting settlement in regards to how all of these efforts of creating a lasting and just peace would be maintained. The French Prime Minister, Ferdinand Foch, said that the peace would only last for 20 years and then there would be another war. And indeed, that's precisely what happened. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany and brought the Nazis into the dominant stage. And they immediately began to initiate various types of racial supremacy laws and types of segregation methods and stuff that would continue to evolve from there. So the Allies lacked a real backbone. The Allies, or the former World War I Allies, didn't really have much in terms of a backbone. The only country that was really strong enough to fight Germany and Japan at the same time was the United States, and America had turned to isolationism and was dealing with the extreme ravages of the Great Depression and the fact that the New Deal was not really that successful overall. So, because America backed out of European politics, the British and the French had to contend with dealing with the Germans as equals on their own. Likewise, another country, the Soviet Union, could have also stammered the growth and expansion of the Nazis, but the British and French were not exactly very uptight about the Stalin government, and all throughout 1939, various attempts were made by the British to create common military pacts with the Soviet Union, and they went virtually nowhere. Especially after the Munich Agreement and the fall of Czechoslovakia into the darkness of the Nazi horde, virtually no treaties of any type could be made with the Soviet Union. And after the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union broke out, the British and French decided that the Soviets were just as aggressive as the Nazis. So anyways, on September the 1st, 1939, just as Ferdinand Foch had predicted back in 1918, the 20 years of peace came to an end when the Gleiwitz incident occurred and fighting began on the border between the Polish army and the Wehrmacht, which then led to the invasion of Poland by the Germans. 3 days later, the British and the French declared war on Germany, but they did not have the heart to join in with the Poles in fighting the Germans, and preferred to sit out the conflict and see how the wind of the war would take place. So the British and French weren't exactly on the best ideas of how to conduct a Second World War. In fact, the French simply retreated behind the Maginot Line and felt that that would convince Hitler that he was not going to be able to invade France. So the Germans very quickly and very effectively sweep out the Poles. The Poles do not really have the military equipment or the tech to fight the state-of-the-art tanks and airplanes, and overall, it very highly developed in modern strategies of blitzkrieg. The end result is the Poles get felted very easily within a month or two. Another thing that happens is that Poland's old nemesis, the Soviet Union, whom the Poles had fought a war against in 1920 and successfully were able to stave off the Bolsheviks in 1920, started a war with them on the Eastern Front because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So the Germans and the Russians both invaded Poland, and within a matter of weeks, Warsaw fell to the Germans and Poland was again carved up. The very brief period of independence of the Poles was over. So the Germans organized their eastern territories into Polonia, Greater East Prussia, West Prussia, Pomerania, the general government, Silesia. So various new Germanized provinces were created. The Poles were expelled from these new Germanized territories and forced to settle in the landlocked general government. In the case of the Soviets, they expanded the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and the Belarusian and Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republics to the west and carved up all of the territory of eastern Poland. This helped to legitimize the Soviets as the direct successors of the Tsar, in the sense that if the Soviets could expand and take over the territories lost during the Bolshevik Revolution and the Civil War, this would legitimize their power and patriotism among the Russians and generate a thrust of Russian nationalism. So Poland gets felted real badly. Warsaw, Leibniz, Warsaw, various other territories, Danzig, are all annexed and militarily taken over, and the cities are pretty much bombed, the Poles are enslaved, and the Jews are put into internment camps. So anyways, what then follows is the Sitzkrieg. The Sitzkrieg is basically the reluctance of the Western Allies to fight the Nazis. So with Lord Halifax and Daladier, as well as Marshal Pétain, Marshal Henri Pétain, there is this idea that Hitler can be swayed in stopping the war and that a common peace can be attained in which Germany can have the predominant influence in Europe, and it would be possible to maintain the integrity of the Western European countries. Lord Halifax comes very, very close to becoming Prime Minister, and if he had been Prime Minister, he would have immediately signed a ceasefire with the Germans, in much of the same way as Daladier and Pétain signed the armistice. But this is not what happened. Instead, the more pro-war and pro-British Empire faction won over in London, and it was decided that Winston Churchill would become the Prime Minister. And he was very determined to ensure that Britain would stand and fight, even if it had to do so alone, in the end. So, the King of Sweden, Gustav, the King of Sweden, as well as the Pope, all tried to make various attempts of overtures for peace to prevent another war from breaking out. Unfortunately, quite unfortunately, these attempts were not done. So, the actual reason why World War II broke out had very little to do with the Holocaust. And I want to emphasize this very strongly. The British, the French, and the Americans did not really care that much about the Germans gassing the Jews at Auschwitz. The reason why the Western Allies got into World War II was for the exact same reasons that they went into World War I. All that World War II actually was simply a restoration of the undoing of the Versailles Treaty and the continuation of the Great War. In 1914, Lord Salisbury and David Lloyd George went into World War I to prevent the Germans from taking over the North Sea ports and becoming too strong on the continent and disrupting the balance of power. In 1939, Chamberlain did the exact same thing, as did Daladier of France. The French and the British feared that the Germans would again perform this Prussian militarism, this Prussian aggressivism that the Germans had been engaging in since 1870 with the Franco-Prussian War, in the sense that Germany was highly Prussianized under the Hohenzollern dynasty, and the Nazis were nothing less than the simple continuation of the Hohenzollern dynasty. The Nazis had picked up where the Kaiser and the Hohenzollerns had failed, and they were continuing the aggressive policies of Otto von Bismarck and Frederick the Great. The notion was, in the minds of the Allies, basically the same thing as in World War I. Prussia, a military, corrupt, bribing state that was based on an old 17th, 18th century feudal baronial system in which the common people had no rights, united Germany and brought it under its yoke, and started World War I and acted very aggressively. The Nazis were simply a continuation in a totalitarian sense, in a dictatorial and totalitarian sense, a mere continuation of the same thing. Most of the politicians and people that were in World War II on the side of the Allies were greatly influenced and had been big players in World War I. So, once again, I want to emphasize the importance that Great Britain, France, and the United States got into a war with Germany because of the threat of Germany going into the Western Hemisphere, going through South America and Central America, and threatening the southern border of the United States. And various types of Nazi German spies and agents in Mexico crossing the border and trying to incite war and battles in the United States through the southern border with Mexico. Canada was concerned about the Germans setting up submarine stations in Iceland and Greenland and attacking and threatening the western coast of Canada. Britain was concerned that if Germany defeated France and the Low Countries and Scandinavian countries, they would take over the North Sea ports and destroy and disrupt the free trade of the British Empire. Now, the British had actually closed up the empire, but once again, the main drive was for the glory of the British Empire. It had very little or nothing to do about some type of great moral drive. Very little of concern about the Holocaust was really made until 1943. So anyways, the French, they pulled back behind the Maginot Line, but the Nazis invade Denmark. Within a few hours of fighting on the border, the Danes surrender. Then the British and the French, they go to Trondheim in central Norway. The Germans cross over the North Sea and invade southern Norway. And some of the first major fighting with the Free Poles, the French and the British, together with the Royal Norwegian Army, takes place in Oslo, Trondheim, and various battles. Also, very early on, the German Navy fights many battles with the Royal Navy. A bunch of great battles between dreadnoughts and battleships and submarines break out in the North Sea. But after the British and French make some successful landings, they withdraw because they are just simply not able to fight the Germans. The Germans are that good of fighters, and they are that effective in taking over Norway. So all of Norway falls to the Germans. The Russians invade Finland, and within a few months of war, they take all of Ingria and various parts of Finland. The Russians also occupy Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania completely, and turn them into Soviet socialist republics. In the West, the Sitzkrieg, or the Sitting War, which is kind of known as the Funny War, comes to a sudden, abrupt end. The Germans sweep into the Netherlands. They invade the Netherlands and bomb Rotterdam and attack and very quickly sweep through and take all of the eastern Netherlands. The Dutch army do put up some fighting, but eventually they surrender in Zeeland and the Netherlands are taken over. Then the Germans push through the Ardennes. They cut through directly into Belgium, and very quickly Belgium falls. Belgium had already suffered very high fatalities in the First World War. They do fight somewhat, but the pincer movements of the Blitzkrieg overwhelms the Belgians, the Dutch, and Luxembourg. They quickly, very swiftly fall under German control. In the case of France, the French build a gigantic Maginot Line, and the Germans, they just go around it. They go right behind it, and in much of the same fashion as they did in the Franco-Prussian War, they take all of the major forts in eastern France. The Germans reoccupy and reannex Alsace and Lorraine together with Luxembourg and turn it into the Westmark. And very swiftly, the Germans chase the British and the French out of, what was it called? Out of that North French city. So this is considered one of the major victories of the British in World War II, the Dunkirk. So the British are bogged down in Dunkirk. And if the Germans had attacked and destroyed all of the British army, the British would have had no military to fight the war. But instead, the Germans withhold, and the British and some of the French are able to escape from Dunkirk, cross the Channel, and return to Britain. So the Germans very swiftly invade and take over all of northern and central France, and the French under Daladier and Pétain surrender and agree to an armistice. The Vichy state is set up, and it is a collaboratory government with the Germans and the Italians. Also, the Italians, they join in World War II, and they invade and take over Nice and Savoy and annex it into Italy. They also invade some other territories south of Switzerland and annex it to Italy. The Italians also begin to attack the British in Egypt from Libya, and there's also fighting in Southeast Africa, in which the Italians invade British and French Somalia, and there's also some fightings in the Mediterranean as well. So then the Battle of Britain commences, a great, epic, and momentous battle. The British stand alone. Hitler is only 36 kilometers across the Channel. And so the fighting commences. The British build up their defenses, they build up their barricades and defense and bunkers. They create special bunker systems in the London Underground and other cities. Children withdraw into the countryside. Bunkers, gas masks, and various other things are set up. And finally, the Luftwaffe flies over England and the massive carpet bombing takes place. So all of Coventry is bombed into absolute smithereens. The entire ancient medieval city of Coventry bombed into rubble. London is bombed to rubble, bombed out into rubble. Even part of the royal palace is destroyed in the attack. Belfast, what's that place in Scotland called? Glasgow, Belfast, Coventry, Bristol, Liverpool, London, all of the major British cities are bombed into oblivion. So about 60,000 Brits die in what becomes known as the Blitz. It lasts from June of 1940 to about, May of 1940 to June of 1941. The entire period of the Battle of Britain takes place. So the RAF is mobilized, and although the RAF is smaller than the German Luftwaffe, and the Germans have somewhat better armaments, they are fighting on their own turf in the airs over Britain. And also, the British have more advanced radar and special weapons capabilities. This allows the tide of the battle to turn in the favor of the British. Eventually, Hitler decides to attack the airfields at first, but the Luftwaffe suffers very heavy casualties. So I think about 2,000 British fighters die and 5,000 German Luftwaffe pilots die. Something like that, maybe more. But regardless, Hitler himself decrees that all of the major British cities should be carpet bombed. And that's exactly what happens during the Blitz. But Churchill says that they shall fight on the landing grounds, they shall fight in the cities, they will fight in the landing fields, they will fight on the coastline, in the mountains, they will never surrender. Winston Churchill is termed to be the mouth of the British lion. The British people are like a lion, and Winston Churchill is the mouth that gives the roar. And indeed, the events of the battle turn, and the Germans call off the invasion of Britain. Although there is a continuation of bombing and a continuation of firebombing, carpet bombing attempts for a year. So regardless, by June of 1941, the Germans abandoned trying to invade Britain in Operation Sea Lion. So the next thing the Germans do is they get into North Africa. Erwin Rommel with the Afrika Korps invades Tunisia and then crosses Libya and goes into Egypt, and there is a bunch of fighting with the Italians and the Germans. The British also occupy Vichy French Syria and Lebanon, and a very short war in Iraq takes place. Also, after a lot of strong, heavy fighting in East Africa, the British retake British and French Somalia and invade Italian Ethiopia and defeat the Italians in East Africa, so the Italians lose all of their colonies in World War II. The Italians are pretty much, they lose the Battle of Otranto in the Mediterranean to the British. Major naval war of Otranto, the Italians lose. The Italians also bomb and attack Gibraltar and Malta, and then there is some fighting in North Africa. The fighting in North Africa actually bogs down into a stalemate of sorts. At the same time, Yugoslavia is invaded. The Yugoslavs fight sort of well, but they're very quickly defeated. The Yugoslavs are ethnically and religiously divided, and Yugoslavia falls very quickly. Romania and Bulgaria join, and they invade Greece. The British fight a few relative battles in Greece, but the Germans very quickly, with the Blitzkrieg, sweep into Athens and take over all of mainland Greece. Eventually, Lysaodomia falls. The Germans invade Crete, but the Cretans put up a very good guerrilla fight in Crete, but eventually Crete also falls. At the same time, in Yugoslavia, you have the Chitniks and the partisans under Josip Broz Tito. And you have the major fighting of the Yugoslav wars, where there is a lot of high fatalities. Now, at first, the Allies support the Chechniks, but eventually they start supporting the communist partisans. Then, the next major move for Hitler is to secure Lebensraum for the Aryan race. And to do that, he must break off the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invade the Soviet Union. Together with various Axis partners, Germany, Italy, Hungary, Romania, and Finland all invade the USSR. It is the greatest land war in human history. A great and epic battle commences on the Eastern Front. Various fortresses in the Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics fall, and the Soviets fall back to Leningrad, Kiev, and Moscow. And eventually the Germans make pretty effective sweeping pincer movements that allow them to grab a lot of land. Also, Finland gets involved in the continuation war, and they invade all of Ingria and make it to the White Sea and go pretty deeply into the northern part of Russia. But as the Russian winter sets in and the Germans approach Moscow, they start to suffer pretty high fatalities, but they continue to fight. So the end result is that in December of 1941, the Battle of Moscow commences. Stalin celebrates the anniversary of the November or the October Revolution of 1917, and he comments about the great legacy of the great nation of the Russians. He talks about Suvorov, Alexander Nevsky, Suvorov, Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, and various other heroes of the Russian past. Soviet patriotism is greatly ignited, and the Russians fight very firmly through brutal house-to-house fighting, block-to-block fighting, and eventually they turn the tide and secure a successful front against the Germans. But the war is far from over. Now, on the other side of the world, the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. So America finally gets into World War II. The Japanese very swiftly invade the Philippines and take over the Philippines. They attack and invade Hong Kong, Macau, Southeast Asia, all the way into Burma and to the border with India. Then they take over the Dutch East Indies after some very tough fighting. A very embarrassing moment for the British is the fall of Singapore. Now, the British, the Indians, and the Singaporeans fight pretty harsh and pretty brutally, but eventually the island of Singapore falls. Also, the port of Darwin, Australia, is bombed by the Japanese. The Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor and other cities in Hawaii on Honolulu Island, and they send weather balloons over the west coast of America and drop various bombs and incendiary artillery pieces on the west coast. The Germans also attack and shoot down a bunch of naval vessels on the east coast and the Gulf of Mexico. And so finally, Germany declares war on the United States. With America now coming into World War II, the overwhelming manufacturing productive forces of the Americans falls into play. The American factories of Pittsburgh, Illinois, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Francisco, all across the American Midwest, all across Detroit, American plants and manufacturing arsenals produce and bring out thousands of tanks, planes, weapons of war, weapons of mass destruction, and very quickly, America is prepared in a matter of weeks to absolutely felt the Axis powers. The American people mobilize in great patriotic hysteria. People sing Yankee Doodle Dandy. The memory and legacy of the American Revolution and the Union effort in the Civil War comes to mind. Various songs from the Civil War and the American Revolution are sung. A lot of commonalities about World War I are brought up. Different types of military bands and patriotic movies and cartoons are produced, and a very strong pro-war and very anti-Japanese sentiment arises in the United States. There is fears that the Japanese and the Germans might land in Mexico or South America and try to infiltrate and bring a wide amount of influence into the Western Hemisphere. This actually turns out to be largely false. There is a bit of Japanese influence in Ecuador, and there's a bit of German influence in Argentina, in Paraguay, but ultimately the Axis do not really have the resources or the capabilities of actually really going into the Western Hemisphere and threatening the United States directly. So because of that, America becomes a battleship of sorts and becomes a massive arsenal for democracy to axe the Axis. There is the notion that we have to get revenge. We have to bomb the literal crap out of the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese because they bombed us. Because they bombed and killed Americans and attacked Americans on American territory and in the American states, there has to be greater bombs, greater guns, more powerful artillery pieces and bullets fired and thrown at them. They have to get a taste of their own medicine, and they have to be completely wrecked and obliterated. So various books, mostly by Jewish authors, are produced about how Germany must perish, what is to be done with Germany, how to get rid of Hirohito, how to fight the fanatical Japanese, and just all sorts of propaganda like that. So anyways, America begins a two-pronged front against the Asian and European Axis powers. In the Pacific, the Americans send a major assault force into the Coral Sea, and the Battle of the Coral Sea commences, and the Japanese actually make some wins, but ultimately the tide turns in America's favor, and the Americans win the Battle of the Coral Sea. Then the Japanese attack Guam and Midway, and the massive Battle of Midway takes place. And although one of the American battleship carriers are sunk, all of the Japanese battleship carriers are sunk by the Americans, and all of the Japanese air fighters are destroyed. Midway never falls to the Japanese. and the naval assault force of the Japanese is thrown back in the Carroll Sea and on Midway Island, and eventually Guam is retaken by the Americans. The Americans sweep through the Guinea Islands, Papua New Guinea, up through New Britain and New Ireland with the Australians, and the British are fighting the Japanese in Burma and Southeast Asia. Now, one of the things that I need to point out about the Allies is they give supplies to Ho Chi Minh, Kim Jim the future dictator of North Korea, as well as Josip Broz Tito. The Americans and the Western Allies send Lend-Lease provisions to the British and the Russians, and they send massive amounts of food and weapons to the Soviet Union, to the Yugoslav partisans, to the Vietnamese communists, and to the Korean and Chinese nationalists and communists. So I want to emphasize how much the Western Allies are supporting the communists in this war. So the ultimate end result is that the Axis do gain a lot of ground and a lot of foot around the globe. But the end result is that they do not have the capability or the human or material potential to deal with the Allies. The Allies superiorly outnumber and outmaneuver the Axis, and the turn of the tide finally does begin to fall into play. So in North Africa, the Germans make it almost to the Nile, but then two battles of El Alamein take place. The British and other Commonwealth forces successfully stave off the Germans in these two battles at El Alamein, and the British win the Battle of El Alamein and drive the Germans out of Egypt. They then cross through Libya. At the same time, the Americans launch Torch operation through West Africa and North Africa, and the Americans land in Morocco and go up into Tunisia through the Kasserine Pass. Now, the Americans lose the first assault, but after the Battle of Kasserine Pass, the Germans are driven into Tunisia. And after a major overland offensive, the Germans en masse surrender in Tunisia. And so the Germans lose in Africa. Then some battles, a few naval battles, happen in the Mediterranean. And there is also an attempt by the Canadians and the British to invade Western France in 1942. It is a complete and utter failure. And as a result of that, the Germans build the North Atlantic Wall. The Germans also occupy southern France and put it under direct military occupation. The next thing that happens is the Allies invade into Sicily, and they very quickly sweep up through Sicily and through the islands of Greece and Crete. The British invade and liberate Greece in 1944, but the Greeks then fall into a civil war in 1944. The Allies very quickly sweep through all of southern Italy, and Mussolini is overthrown, but he's brought back into power in the northern Salo Republic. The Anzio, the Battle of the Anzio, then takes place, which is a major and successful naval and land battle offensive with air support, in which the Americans play the Germans at their own game and take all of central Italy. Then the Battle of San Marino takes place. Very brutal, very powerful battle. The Poles give a lot of enormous amounts of support. And finally, the Americans win the Battle of Monte Cassino, which is a battle around a medieval Benedictine monastery. And then, within weeks, the Allies go into Rome. In the Pacific region, the Americans sweep through the Guineas and the Solomons. The Battle of Tarawa and the various battles of the Solomon Islands take place. The Marianas, the Solomons, the Guineas, all of these different island chains are retaken. But the Japanese fight very brutally, very inhumanely, and they commit all sorts of awful, horrendous atrocities. So the American army has to fight very harsh and very brutal itself. But the Americans do retake the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. The Americans do successfully retake all of these various islands. The British, with the Ankhorst and the Prince of Wales, go across from the North Atlantic to the Indian Ocean and lose a battle to the Japanese. Both of these ships are sunk by submarines of the Japanese Navy. So the next major battle is the Battle of Tarawa and the some battle in the Central Pacific. I forgot its name. There's a couple of operations. The Japanese invade and occupy Thailand and Burma after they take over Southeast Asia. And then the Japanese invade India, and there is some fighting in India that takes place. Two major battles. The British and the Indians win both battles, and the Japanese are driven out. And the British army invades and retakes Rangoon, and they discover all of these different internment camps where the Japanese had prisoners of war, where they basically starved them to death. So in the Soviet Union, after the Battle of Moscow, the Germans move south. They fight the Battle of the Caucasus, and they go into Volgograd. And so what the Russians end up doing is they have this so-called Rin's meat grinder that takes place. After that great battle, then you have the Battle of Stalingrad. The Germans refer to the Battle of Stalingrad as Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. And indeed, this is perhaps the lowest ebb of World War II, in which 1 million or 2.5 million Germans die, and about 3 million Russians die in the Rat War of Stalingrad. A great and epic and brutal fight breaks out in late 1942. The Germans flatten and carpet bomb the shit out of Stalingrad. Then they invade and they almost take over the entire city. And a great gigantic swastika is raised over the ruins of Stalingrad. And a lot of German mass propaganda is produced, claiming that it is a total and complete victory over Judeo-Bolshevism. But then the Soviet Russians regroup, they cross the Volga River, and they retake all of Stalingrad. The fighting is absolutely brutal. House to house, block to block, street to street. The Russians outnumber. They outgun and they overpower the Germans. They surround them. They take out their Hungarian and Italian allies, and then they force the Germans under von Paulus into surrender. The Battle of Stalingrad is an absolute catastrophe for the Germans. The next thing that happens is the tank battle of Kursk, which is a railroad hub somewhere in the Caucasus, in the Volgograd region or whatever. The Germans make a bunch of sweeping pincer movements, but the Russians felt them at their own game. The Russians completely overpower and tactically take the advantage and outmaneuver the Germans and win the Battle of Kursk. The next thing that majorly happens is the Russians begin to break the siege of Leningrad and sweep westward. So the Americans and the British and the Commonwealth forces break through the Gothic and the Lombard lines, and then you have Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings. Now, Eisenhower almost calls off the D-Day landings. Another thing that happens, too, is that at the very same time that the D-Day landings happen, the Germans fire V-1 and then V-2 rockets on London and at different British centers. So rockets are fired across the North Sea and throw a bunch of bombs on Britain. But this does not deter the Allies. They send a gigantic, massive fleet, an invasion force across the Channel, and take and invade Normandy. The major landing points are Utah, Juneau, various types of landing fields. Now, at the first assault, the Americans and the British take tremendous heavy casualties. The Germans utterly shoot, maim, and kill the Americans as they make the first assault. It is a very brutal, blood-drenching episode of epic proportions. The Americans almost lose, but as the power and the assault and the massive resources of the Allies begin to go in and get pushed in, the tide turns and the Allies successfully liberate Normandy. Cayenne is bombed by the American Air Force, and the Allies push into northern France. They then go through a major pocket in central France, but then the Germans and the Waffen-SS hold the Americans and the Allies down in brutal fighting, and they actually gain a bit of an offensive, but the tide turns and the Germans are driven out of France. Then there are the landings in Corsica and southern France. Paris is liberated. Charles de Gaulle goes back into Paris, and there is a massive uproar in Paris in excitement of the liberation and the revival and the rebirth of France. The French people cry out, "Vive la France! Vive la de Gaulle!" So anyways, the Allies continue through various battles in southern France and through northern Italy, and they basically defeat the Italians and defeat the Vichy French and drive the Germans out of France. Now, in the Soviet Union, there is Operation Bagration. But before that, Kiev is retaken and liberated. Crimea and most of the Ukraine is retaken by the Soviets, and then all of central and western Russia is taken in a massive offensive. What then follows is Operation Bagration, which breaks the resolve of the Germans. Operation Bagration is an absolute disaster for the Nazis. All of Poland, or most of Poland down to Warsaw, all of Belarus, and the borders of Europe are completely liberated from the Germans in this massive land swoop. The Allies are also fighting the Battle of Arnhem in the Netherlands, and they push up into the Netherlands and defeat the Germans in the Battle of Arnhem. Then there is the Battle of the Bulge. The American Army, or the American Armed Forces, suffer the greatest fatalities in U.S. military history during the Battle of the Bulge. It is perhaps one of the very few offensives outside of the Civil War in which Americans sustain enormous military casualties. The Germans sweep through in a massive pincer attack through the frozen tundra and the frozen woodlands of the Ardennes, and they invade and take a massive ground This is the last successful overland offensive of the Germans in World War II. A lot of Americans die. A lot of Americans, especially black Americans, are taken as POWs. But the Germans, just as they did in 1918, run out of men, supplies, and materials. They outrun their supply lines, they run out of bullets, and they start to effectively lose. The tide turns, and the Americans and other military forces take back all of the land lost in the Battle of the Bulge. And before long, the northern Netherlands are invaded and the Rhine is crossed. The Russians invade Romania. They go into Romania and also into Bulgaria. The British invade and liberate Greece. The Yugoslav partisans take over Yugoslavia and drive the Germans and Axis forces out of Yugoslavia. And then there is a very brutal series of battles that take place in Romania and then in Hungary. All of Budapest is completely carpet bombed, artillery bombed, and artillery shelled into oblivion. A series of major land battles in western Hungary takes place, and these are the last major land wars of the Germans. Finland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Italy, and the Salo Republic all surrender to the Allies. And then finally, the Allies invade Germany. There is massive rape, massive destruction, massive amounts of looting and stealing that goes on as the Allies push into Germany. The Germans do not surrender very easily. A lot of very brutal, very blood-drenching, very hostile calamities take place between the Allies and the Germans. The Volkssturm is set up, and they fight pretty well, or pretty decently well, but the Russians take Berlin. And at the same time, there is the Battle of Zelo Heights, and that is the last major battle in World War II in Europe. After that, the Russian red banner of the hammer and sickle flies over the Reichstag. Adolf Hitler is completely felted as the Führer. He puts a gun to his head and he blows his fucking brains out, and his corpse is burned. He is absolutely incinerated and destroyed because of his epileptic madness and insanity in driving Germany into utter ruin. So the Germans surrender, all of the Axis forces in Europe surrender, and so what happens is that Germany is divided into different occupation zones. The Polish People's Republic, which is created and set up as a communist proxy state, takes all of the land to the east, to the east of the Oder-Neisse River. So Germany loses all land east of the Oder-Neisse River. And then Germany loses Alsace and Lorraine again to the French, Eupen, and Malmedy to Belgium. South Tyrol is again given back to Italy. Even though Italy was technically a loser, it still gets back South Tyrol from the Germans. Austria is separated into a separate state again and divided by the Russians, British, French, and Americans. Germany is turned into occupation zones by the British, Americans, Russians, and French. The Americans occupy Bavaria, all of the entire southwest, and the port of Bremen and Hamburg. The British occupy Hanover and all of the southwest. The Soviets occupy Berlin and most of the east or the northeast of Germany, and the French occupy a part of Western Germany. And so Germany completely loses its statehood. So for the Allies, the idea that Germany is naturally an aggressor and a violator of international peace and order, so it cannot be allowed to continue as a state. There has to be denazification and democratization to the Germans, and a stable and long-lasting multi-party parliamentary democracy must be set up in the long run. The Nuremberg trials execute and hang most of the Nazi war criminals after the war. In the Pacific, the natural tide turns in favor of the Allies. The Japanese overrun their supply lines and they begin to starve. There is massive starvation and very low nutrition among the Japanese. And after the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, the Japanese are never able to gain any major ground as they did before. The British retake Rangoon, they invade Burma, and they eventually get into Laos and the Southeast and to Southeast Asia. Late in World War II, the French invade and retake Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Chinese win a lot of major important battles in central and northern China, and as a result, the Chinese Red Army completely wins the mass support of the Chinese peasants, which will pave the way for the victory of Mao Zedong in 1949 and the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. So regardless, the Americans retake Leon Glen, the Solomons, the Marianas, etc. They sweep through all of the island chains of the South and Central Pacific. Then there is the Great Battle of Midway Island. The Battle of Iwo Jima. The Battle of Iwo Jima is extremely brutal. It is very heart-wrenching, but the Marines land the largest Marine force in U.S. history. And after a lot of brutal fighting, fire-torching, flame-throwing, in which a bunch of Japanese are burned out of the caves and killed mercilessly, and after a lot of heavy fighting and bombing and artillery shelling and battleship shelling and air bombing, the Japanese surrender on Midway. Then, months later, the U.S. Army invades Okinawa. Also, the Stars and Stripes are raised on Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. Very brutal, very heavy battle, probably the heaviest fighting of Americans in World War II on Iwo Jima. So next, the Americans invade Okinawa. The Americans drive through. There is basically a genocide of Okinawans and Japanese. The Japanese army holds out, but 250,000 Japanese die, 1 million Okinawans die, and about 60 to 70 to 80,000 Americans die. But the Americans are extremely determined. They fight through and they win and defeat the Japanese on Okinawa. Okinawa is then occupied and turned into a major military base for the Americans until basically now the present. America still has a lot of important air bases and military facilities on Okinawa. So the next thing that happens is that at Los Alamos in New Mexico, the first atomic bomb in history explodes. And Americans now have the new atomic science. The Russian Red Army breaks its neutral treaty with the Japanese and invades southern Sakhalin Island and then drives into Manchukuo. There is heavy fighting. 700,000 Japanese die, and a bunch of Manchukuians also die. There is brutal fighting and kamikaze attacks on both sides, but eventually all of Manchuria falls under Russian control and the Kwantung army is defeated. The next thing that happens is a planned invasion of Japan. The Japanese set up a home army and an air defense fleet, but they are no match for the Americans. Starting with the Doolittle raid, the Americans utterly firebomb and carpet bomb all of the major Japanese cities of Kyoto, Okinawa, Yokohama, and Tokyo. So all of the major Japanese cities and over 70% of Japanese light and heavy industry is destroyed by the end of World War II. 5.6 million Germans and 2.7 million Japanese die. 350,000 Americans die. 400 something thousand Brits die. And about 600,000 French die. Over 23 million Russians die in World War II. So there is a planned massive invasion of southern Japan. This doesn't happen. Instead, an atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima and the entire city is just felted. Another atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki and is completely felted. But there isn't really an initiative by the Japanese to surrender. But finally, Emperor Hirohito denounces his divinity as a god and says that the Americans and the Russians have produced weapons of such massive destructive proportions, it is impossible to continue the Greater East Asian War. So the ultimate end result is the Japanese Imperial Cabinet and the Imperial Household Protection Society finally give in and surrender to the Allies. And so on the USS Missouri, the Japanese signed the agreement of unconditional surrender. The Germans signed unconditional surrender in Berlin and Flensburg, and Japan is then occupied by the Americans. British, New Zealanders, Australians, Canadians, and some Chinese occupy some of the port cities of Japan, but instead all of Japan is occupied by the United States, and a new constitution, the post-war Showa Constitution, is drawn up in Washington and is given to the emperor. The emperor, the cabinet, and parliament agree, and a massive defacifcation, demilitarization, and democratization of Japan gets underway. And so, with the defeat of the Axis powers, the Second World War comes to an end. All right, so I am now done with the geopolitics of World War II. I will be going into the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union and the Cold War, or the outbreak of the Cold War, next time. I will talk about the massive global influence of communism in the developing world, and I will talk to you about all of the different implications about the spread and influence of communism and the rise and dominance of American hegemony. So, the biggest major thing in my mind about the end of World War II is the destruction of the European world order. It's not just merely the Italians and the Germans that lose out and lose their military and imperial influence. The British Empire, even though it was their finest hour in 1940, almost immediately, as soon as Germany and Japan surrender, the British Empire falls apart. The Dutch and the British empires and the Belgian Empire begin to very quickly dissolve. Africans and Asians rise up and declare the end of white rule and the end of colonialism. Almost immediately, as soon as World War II is over, there is a massive anti-colonial revolt. The British Empire and the Dutch Empire, within a matter of just a few years, cease to exist. This is effectively the end of the European world order, or the European-led world order as we knew it in the past. The consensus of the dominance of Great Britain, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and the European powers is coming to an end. The massive colonial empires of the French, the Dutch, and the British are going to fall apart. And the ultimate result is that the United States of America, through this war, becomes the predominant military and economic power. In the Arctic, in the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, on all of the high seas of the globe, American battleships, submarines, and aircraft carriers dominate the seas of the world. British trade is gone. The British massive global network of trade was obliterated by the Second World War, and in the wake of the fall of the British, the Americans have control of the high seas. Now it is the age of Pax Americana that is taking shape in the wake of the Second World War. America is now the dominant producer and manufacturing hub of the world. Because the United States did not really suffer any major high fatalities on the home front, none of the American cities were bombed in the war. America very quickly is able to felt war-torn, demolished Europe and Germany into becoming the dominant manufacturing producing hub of the world. The American dollar, through the Bretton Woods Agreement, becomes the sole global currency of the world. American companies begin to go overseas and become dominant. And American influence pours into Europe and East Asia, and even the Middle East and Africa for the first time. The American global influence spreads out of the Western Hemisphere into Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australasia. The American Army has military bases all across Western Europe, in what will become the NATO countries in Africa, in the Middle East, in the Far East, and Australia. All of the Commonwealth countries of New Zealand, South Africa, Ireland, and Australia and Canada begin to shift their primary military alliance away from Great Britain to the United States. America becomes a superpower. But there is another. There is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Soviet Union expands its communist influence into Eastern Europe with its proxy states, as well as into China, North Korea, and North Vietnam, and Laos. And eventually, even the island of Cuba falls under Soviet influence. This is the end of the European-led world order and the beginning of American predominance over the world. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation of the geopolitics of World War II. Thank you for watching. Brucey Kaboots, I love these streams. Let's go! Galdi Gadophilia says, let's go! What's up, Galdi? Coffee says based. Ghost of Niccolo, let's go! What's up, Ghost of Niccolo? ZXV, why did you eat Euros? If I were to eat Euros, that would be cannibalism. I would be committing cannibalism, and that would be against the law, so I think that answers your question. Cool tactic. When you dox, you lose. Do you have any proof to demonstrate that was a thing, dude? So yeah, I don't have no idea what happened to Euros. I didn't watch his last stream. If somebody can bring up the last stream of Euros so that I can see it and see what actually happened in the chat, maybe I'll be able to answer that, but otherwise, yeah, I can't help you, buddy. You're barking up the wrong tree, dog. ASDF, why did you and Reformed Stoic break up? I kind of wanted to go my own way and sort of do my own thing. Stoic is just really kind of more focused on the black pill and the MGTOW stuff. And, that's fine. I really don't care what Stoic does. I wish him the best, and, I hope he succeeds. Brucey Caboots, there was an impersonator in the chat. Oh, there was someone that had an alt that was like me. Forge Warhammer in his chat that doxed his name or something. Yeah, that wasn't me, bro. Sorry that happened to Euros, but Euros is kind of an idiot when it comes to hiding his personal information. He has his own self to blame, just like Shaggy. The problem with Euros is that he believes everything the Daimyo and Mormon Shaggy tells him, and that's the main problem. And lots of alts dropping his docs. That's the J-Danks army. That's probably the J-Danks people that are doing that. J-Danks and Plate Gang, they watch everything that goes on in this corner. Yeah, I didn't think it was you. Alright, so at the end of World War II, America is the predominant power. Like, America is the dominant military, economic power of the world. America led the free world through World War II. It is going to lead the free world through the upcoming Cold War and the nuclear crisis. And so, yeah, the United States in 1945 is the one single preeminent major power in the world. The Soviets and the British, no match for the Americans. No one stands a chance against the might of the Pax Americana. So I will get into that next time, and I will see you then. Forge Gang!